The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey as Prince William walked slowly through the empty corridors. His footsteps echoed in the vast space, each sound seeming to carry the weight of centuries of history. Today was different from other days. Today he wasn't here for a ceremony or official event. He was here because he needed to think, to feel connected to something larger than himself. Kate had arrived earlier, finding her own quiet corner near the altar, where she often came when the pressures of royal life became too overwhelming. She knelt in silent prayer, her hands folded in her lap, her mind wandering to their children and the world they would inherit. The responsibility of preparing George, Charlotte, and Louis for their royal duties weighed heavily on her heart. William found her there, as he somehow knew he would. They had developed this unspoken understanding over the years of marriage, this ability to sense when the other needed comfort or companionship. He approached quietly, not wanting to disturb her peaceful moment, but she looked up and smiled softly when she heard his familiar footsteps. "I thought I might find you here," he whispered, settling beside her on the worn wooden bench. The Abbey held special meaning for them both. This was where they had exchanged vows in front of millions of people around the world, where they had promised to support each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. Kate reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had become natural over their years together. "I was thinking about the children," she admitted, her voice barely audible in the sacred space. "About what kind of world we're preparing them for, what kind of monarchy they'll inherit." The conversation that followed was one they had been avoiding for months. The changing world around them demanded new approaches to royal duty, new ways of connecting with people who increasingly questioned the relevance of an ancient institution. William had been feeling the pressure from all sides, from his father, who wanted to maintain certain traditions, from advisors who pushed for modernization, and from his own conscience, which told him that change was not just necessary but inevitable. "Sometimes I wonder if we're doing enough," William confessed, staring up at the magnificent ceiling above them. "The world is moving so fast and people are facing real struggles. Climate change, economic uncertainty, social inequality. How do we make the monarchy relevant to someone who's worried about paying their rent or feeding their family?" Kate squeezed his hand gently. She had been thinking about the same things, especially after their recent visits to food banks and homeless shelters. The gap between their privileged life and the reality many people faced had never felt more apparent. Yet she also saw how their presence brought comfort to people, how their support could shine light on important causes and actually make a difference. "We do it by showing up," she said finally. "By listening, by using our platform to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard." She paused, thinking about their recent trip to a mental health facility, where they had met young people struggling with depression and anxiety. "Remember what that teenager said to us last week? That it meant everything to her that we took the time to really listen to her story." William nodded, remembering the girl who had fought back tears as she shared her struggles with mental health. The moment had reminded him why they did this work, why their role mattered beyond the ceremonies and official engagements. But it also highlighted the delicate balance they had to maintain between being accessible and maintaining the dignity of the institution they represented. The Abbey around them held the memories of coronations and royal weddings, of state funerals and moments of national celebration and mourning. Every stone seemed to whisper stories of monarchs who had faced their own challenges, who had adapted and evolved to serve their people through changing times. William thought about his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, and how she had navigated decades of social and political transformation while maintaining the stability and continuity that people looked to the monarchy to provide. "Do you think we're ready?" Kate asked, voicing the question that had been lurking in both their minds. Everyone knew that William's time as heir would not last forever, that someday he would be called upon to lead not just as a prince, but as a king. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. William was quiet for a long moment, considering her question. "I don't think anyone can ever be truly ready for something like this," he said finally. "But I think we can be prepared. We can surround ourselves with good people, listen to different perspectives, and remember that our job is to serve, not to be served." They sat in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The Abbey had witnessed centuries of British history unfold, had seen the monarchy adapt and survive through world wars, social revolutions, and technological transformations. Now it was their turn to carry that legacy forward, to find ways to honor tradition while embracing necessary change. Kate looked around at the ancient walls and thought about all the royal couples who had stood in this very spot, facing their own uncertainties about the future. Some had succeeded brilliantly, others had struggled, but all had been part of an unbroken chain connecting the past to the present and extending into the future. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together," she said, echoing the vows they had made in the same sacred space years earlier. William smiled, feeling some of the weight lift from his shoulders. They had each other. They had their shared commitment to service, and they had the love and support of their children. As they prepared to leave, William took one last look around the Abbey. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve their country and their people, but for now, in this moment of quiet reflection, he felt ready to face whatever the future might hold. The following morning brought unexpected news that would test everything William and Kate had discussed in the quiet sanctuary of Westminster Abbey. William's private secretary arrived at Kensington Palace with a concerned expression and a folder of mourning. Briefings that painted a troubling picture of public sentiment. Recent polls showed a significant shift in how younger generations viewed the monarchy. Support among people under 30 had dropped to its lowest point in decades, with many questioning whether the institution had any place in modern Britain. Social media was filled with debates about the cost of maintaining royal households, while families struggled with rising energy bills and food prices. Kate found William in his study, surrounded by newspapers and reports, his brow furrowed with worry. The headlines were harsh, with some calling for serious reforms and others suggesting the monarchy had become an outdated luxury the country could no longer afford. One particularly stinging editorial questioned whether the next generation of royals understood the real concerns of ordinary people. "This is exactly what we were talking about yesterday," William said, gesturing to the pile of papers. "How do we bridge this gap? How do we show people that we're not just figments from a fairy tale, but real people who genuinely care about their welfare?" Kate picked up one of the newspapers, reading the criticism with a mixture of sadness and determination. She had always known that their privileged position would invite scrutiny, but seeing it laid out so bluntly was still difficult. Yet she also saw opportunity in the challenge. "Maybe this is our chance to do things differently," she suggested. "Instead of just responding to criticism, what if we proactively showed people who we really are? Not through official statements or carefully staged events, but through genuine engagement with the issues that matter most to them." Their conversation was interrupted by a phone call from William's father, King Charles, who had seen the same reports and was concerned about the implications for the entire royal family. The king's voice carried the weight of experience as he reminded William that weathering public criticism was part of royal life. But he also acknowledged that the current challenges felt different from anything the family had faced before. After the call ended, William and Kate made a decision that would surprise their staff and possibly their critics. Instead of retreating behind palace walls or issuing formal responses through spokespersons, they decided to spend the next few days visiting communities across Britain, but not in the usual way. They would travel without the typical royal fanfare, with minimal security, and they would listen more than they spoke. Their first stop was a housing estate in South London, where families were struggling with unemployment and inadequate social services. Instead of the usual red carpet treatment, they knocked on doors and accepted invitations into people's homes. In one small flat, they sat at a kitchen table with Maria Santos, a single mother of 3 who was working 2 part-time jobs just to pay rent. "I don't know anything about being royal," Maria said honestly, "but I know what it's like to lie awake at night worrying about whether you can give your children a decent life. Can you understand that feeling?" Kate's eyes filled with tears as she listened to Maria describe the impossible choices she faced every day, between heating and eating, between school supplies and medicine, between hope and despair. William found himself thinking about his own children, safe and secure at home, never having to wonder where their next meal would come from. "We can't pretend to fully understand your daily struggles," William admitted, "but we can promise that your voice matters to us. Your story matters, and we want to help amplify that voice so that people in positions of power hear what you're telling us." From there, they visited a food bank where volunteers worked tirelessly to feed families in need. They met elderly people choosing between prescription medications and groceries. They spoke with young people who had given up on finding stable employment and were sleeping in hostels or on friends' couches. Each conversation challenged their assumptions and deepened their understanding of the complex problems facing modern Britain. They began to see patterns in the stories they heard, not just individual hardships, but systemic issues that required sustained attention and coordinated solutions. At a community center in Manchester, they encountered a group of teenagers who were initially skeptical about meeting royals. One young man named Jamie asked them directly, "What can you actually do for people like us? You live in palaces while we live in council flats. How can you possibly understand our world?" Instead of being defensive, William and Kate engaged with his questions honestly. They acknowledged their privileged position, but also shared their genuine desire to use that privilege constructively. They talked about their own struggles with mental health, their fears as parents, and their determination to serve their country in meaningful ways. By the end of the conversation, Jamie's attitude had shifted slightly. "You're not what I expected," he admitted. "I thought you'd just give us some speech about duty and tradition, but you actually listened to what we had to say." As they traveled from community to community, word of their unconventional approach began to spread. Local media picked up on the story of the royal couple who were choosing to engage with criticism rather than ignore it, who were seeking out difficult conversations rather than avoiding them. The response was mixed but increasingly positive. People appreciated their willingness to step outside the traditional royal bubble, to see firsthand the realities that most of their subjects faced every day. Social media began to fill with stories from people who had met them, many expressing surprise at how genuine and down-to-earth they had seemed. But the real test would come when they returned to Westminster Abbey the following week for a scheduled service. As they walked through the same doors where they had shared their private moment of reflection, they carried with them the voices and stories of everyone they had met. The ancient stones seemed to echo not just with royal history, but with the hopes and struggles of ordinary people who looked to the monarchy for leadership and inspiration. Kate squeezed William's hand as they took their seats, both knowing that their understanding of their role had been forever changed by the experiences of the past few days. They had taken their first steps toward building a bridge between the institution they represented and the people they served. The service at Westminster Abbey that Sunday was unlike any William and Kate had attended before. As they sat in the ancient pews, their minds kept drifting to the faces they had met during their unconventional tour of Britain. Maria Santos, the single mother from South London, Jamie, the skeptical teenager from Manchester, the elderly gentleman at the food bank who had served his country in the military, but now couldn't afford to heat his home. When the Archbishop invited the congregation to reflect on service and sacrifice, William found himself thinking not about royal duty in the abstract, but about the concrete ways their position could make a real difference in people's lives. The familiar hymns and prayers took on new meaning, filtered through the experiences of the past week. After the service, something unprecedented happened. Instead of leaving immediately for their official cars, William and Kate lingered outside the Abbey, engaging with members of the public who had gathered to see them. Word had spread about their recent community visits, and people seemed eager to share their own stories and concerns. An elderly woman named Dorothy approached Kate hesitantly. "Your Highness," she began, then paused. "I hope it's all right to speak to you like this, but I wanted to thank you for visiting that housing estate. My granddaughter lives there, and she said you really listened to what people were saying." Kate smiled warmly. "Please tell me about your granddaughter. What challenges is she facing?" What followed was a 20-minute conversation right there on the steps of Westminster Abbey, with Dorothy describing her family's struggles with housing costs and her granddaughter's dreams of becoming a teacher, despite the financial obstacles she faced. Other people gathered around, drawn by the unusual sight of royals having genuine conversations with ordinary citizens. A young father named Peter shared his concerns about his autistic son's education, explaining how cuts to special needs programs were affecting families like his. A nurse named Sarah talked about the stress of working in an understaffed hospital while trying to care for her own aging parents. William listened intently to each story, asking thoughtful questions and taking notes on his phone. "Would you be willing to stay in touch?" he asked Sarah. "I'd like to learn more about the challenges facing our healthcare workers." The scene was being recorded by news cameras, and shared widely on social media. But for once, the royal couple seemed unconcerned about managing their public image. They were focused entirely on the people in front of them, treating each conversation as an opportunity to deepen their understanding of modern Britain. Their spontaneous public engagement lasted over an hour, far longer than any scheduled royal walkabout. By the time they finally headed home, they had exchanged contact information with dozens of people and promised to follow up on many of the issues they had heard about. That evening, as they put their children to bed, George asked his father about the people they had been meeting. "Why were some of them sad, Papa?" the young prince wanted to know. William sat on the edge of his son's bed, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people face problems that are very difficult to solve on their own," he explained. "Part of our job as a family is to help find ways to make those problems smaller." Charlotte, ever perceptive, chimed in from her own bed. "Like when I help Louis when he's scared of the dark?" "Exactly like that," Kate said, touched by her daughter's instinctive understanding of helping others. "We use our voices and our position to help people who might not be heard otherwise." Louis, the youngest, simply declared that he wanted to help too, which made both parents smile despite the weight of the conversations they had been having. Later that night, William and Kate sat in their private living room, going through the notes they had taken during their community visits and their impromptu conversations after the church service. They began to see connections between the individual stories they had heard and larger systemic issues that required coordinated responses. "We could establish a foundation focused specifically on these interconnected challenges," Kate suggested. "Housing, healthcare, education, employment, they're all linked. Maybe instead of addressing them separately, we could work on comprehensive solutions." William nodded, his mind already working through the possibilities. "And we could ensure that people like Maria and Sarah and Peter are directly involved in designing those solutions. Not just recipients of charity, but partners in creating change." They began sketching out ideas for a new kind of royal engagement, one that went beyond traditional patronages and ceremonial roles to tackle real problems with sustained effort and measurable outcomes. They envisioned regular community listening sessions, partnerships with local organizations, and direct advocacy for policy changes that could improve people's lives. The more they talked, the more excited they became about the potential impact of their evolving approach, but they also recognized the challenges they would face. Some members of the establishment would be uncomfortable with such direct royal involvement in social and political issues. Critics might accuse them of overstepping their constitutional role, or of using their position to push particular agendas. "We'll need to be careful about how we frame this," William acknowledged. "We're not trying to replace elected officials or solve problems that require legislative solutions. But we can use our platform to ensure that important voices are heard and that successful local initiatives get the support and recognition they need to expand." Kate pulled up articles on her laptop about other modern royals who had successfully navigated similar challenges. Look at what Crown Princess Victoria has done in Sweden, or how the Dutch royal family has modernized their approach to public service. We're not the first to face these questions about relevance and connection. As they researched and planned, both felt a growing sense of purpose and possibility. The criticism they had faced the previous week, which had initially felt like a crisis, was beginning to look more like an opportunity for transformation. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Kate said as they prepared for bed. "That moment in the Abbey yesterday morning when we were wondering if we were ready for whatever comes next. I think what we've learned this week is that being ready isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to ask the right questions and listen to the responses." William agreed, feeling more optimistic about their future role than he had in months. They were beginning to chart a course that honored royal tradition while embracing necessary innovation, that respected constitutional limits while maximizing their potential for positive impact. 3 weeks after their transformative community visits, William and Kate found themselves facing their first major test of this new approach. A factory closure in Wales had left 300 families without income, and the local MP had requested royal support to draw national attention to the situation and pressure the government for assistance. Traditional protocol would have called for a carefully orchestrated visit, with prepared speeches and photo opportunities designed to show royal concern without creating political complications. But William and Kate had committed themselves to a different path. one that prioritized genuine engagement over careful image management. They traveled to the Welsh town of Cwmgrac on a gray Tuesday morning, arriving not in official cars but in a simple Range Rover driven by William himself. Instead of being met by local dignitaries and carefully selected representatives, they went directly to the community center where laid-off workers had been gathering daily to share information and support each other. The scene that greeted them was far from the polished events they were accustomed to. Frustrated families filled folding chairs in a drafty hall, their conversations a mixture of anger, fear, and determination. Children played in one corner while their parents discussed impossible choices about mortgages and school fees, and elderly relatives who depended on their support. Gareth Williams, a man in his 50s who had worked at the factory for 30 years, approached them with a directness that palace staff would have found alarming. "So what can you actually do for us?" he asked, echoing the question they had heard from Jamie in Manchester. "We need jobs, not sympathy." William extended his hand for a firm handshake. "You're absolutely right, Gareth. Sympathy won't pay your bills or feed your family. We're here to understand exactly what kind of support would make a real difference, and then to use whatever influence we have to make that happen." What followed was 3 hours of intensive listening and note-taking. Kate sat with a group of women who had formed a childcare cooperative to help each other through the crisis. William joined a discussion among men who were debating whether to relocate their families in search of work or to fight for new industries to be established in their community. Sarah Jenkins, a mother of 2 young children, broke down as she described receiving an eviction notice that morning. "We've never asked for handouts," she said through her tears. "My husband worked every day for 15 years, paid his taxes, supported his community. Now we're being treated like we're somehow to blame for the factory closing." Kate moved her chair closer to Sarah's, offering tissues and asking gentle questions about what kind of immediate support the family needed. She learned about the complex web of assistance programs that families were trying to navigate, each with different requirements and waiting periods that seemed designed to discourage rather than help people in crisis. An elderly man named Tom Roberts had a different perspective. "I've seen this town survive the coal mine closures in the 80s, he told William. "We rebuilt then and we can rebuild now. But we need investment in training programs that actually lead to real jobs, not just government promises that disappear after the next election." By the end of the morning, William and Kate had filled several pages with specific suggestions and requests. The community wasn't asking for charity, but for support in creating sustainable solutions. They wanted help establishing a training center for renewable energy jobs. They needed temporary financial assistance to prevent families from losing their homes while they retrained or searched for new employment. They wanted their local politicians to understand the human cost of economic decisions made in distant offices. During lunch at the community center, sharing simple sandwiches and tea with the families, William made a decision that surprised even Kate. He pulled out his phone and called the Welsh secretary directly, putting the call on speaker so everyone could hear. "Minister, I'm in Cwmgrac with families affected by the factory closure," he said when the surprised official answered. "I have some specific requests for support that I'd like to discuss with you today, not next week or next month." The conversation that followed was unprecedented. A future king was essentially advocating directly for government action, while surrounded by the people who would be affected by those decisions. Constitutional experts would later debate whether William had overstepped proper boundaries, but in that moment the families in the room felt heard and supported in a way they never had before. The Welsh secretary agreed to visit the community himself within the week and to expedite several assistance programs that had been stalled in bureaucratic processes. He also committed to exploring the renewable energy training proposal with his department's economic development team. After lunch, William and Kate visited individual families in their homes, seeing firsthand how the factory closure was affecting children's education plans, elderly parents' care arrangements, and family relationships strained by financial pressure. Each visit deepened their understanding of how economic disruption rippled through entire communities in ways that statistics and briefing papers could never capture. Their final stop was at the home of Marcus and Janet Powell, both in their early 60s who had planned to retire in a few years but now faced the prospect of losing their home. Marcus had been a supervisor at the factory and felt a personal responsibility for his younger colleagues who were struggling with unemployment. The hardest part, isn't even our own situation," Janet explained as they sat in her tidy living room surrounded by family photos. "It's watching young families break apart under the stress. Marriages failing, children acting out at school because they can sense their parents' fear. This isn't just about jobs, and it's about the fabric of our community." Kate asked about the support networks that we're developing, learning about informal childcare arrangements, food-sharing systems, and the way neighbors were helping each other through the crisis. She saw how resilient communities could be when they worked together, but also how they needed external support to bridge the gap between crisis and recovery. As they prepared to leave Cwmgrach, William and Kate promised to return in 6 months to check on the progress of the initiatives they had discussed. They exchanged personal contact information with several families and committed to staying informed about the community's situation through regular updates. The drive home was quiet, both of them processing what they had experienced. They had moved far beyond traditional royal engagement into something that felt more like community organizing than ceremonial duty. The response would undoubtedly be mixed, with some praising their hands-on approach and others criticizing their direct involvement in political and economic issues. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Kate asked as they navigated the Welsh countryside. William considered the question carefully. "I think we did what felt honest and necessary," he replied. "Whether it was technically right according to traditional standards, I'm not sure. But those people deserve to have someone with influence actually listen to them and try to help." They both knew that their approach was evolving in ways that would challenge established expectations and protocols, but they also felt more connected to their purpose as public servants than they ever had before. The backlash came swiftly and from multiple directions. Within 24 hours of their visit to Cwmgrach, William and Kate found themselves at the center of a constitutional controversy that dominated newspaper headlines and sparked heated debates in Parliament. Conservative MPs criticized the Prince of Wales for overstepping his role by making direct phone calls to government ministers on behalf of specific communities. Opposition leaders accused him of selective intervention, questioning why this particular factory closure had received royal attention when similar situations elsewhere had been ignored. Constitutional scholars debated whether the future king had compromised the political neutrality that was essential to the monarchy's survival. The most stinging criticism came from an unexpected source. Lord Pemberton, a longtime royal advisor who had served 3 previous generations of the family. In a carefully worded but devastating interview, he suggested that William and Kate were dangerously naive about the constitutional implications of their actions and were risking the institution they were meant to protect. The monarchy survives by remaining above the fray of daily politics, Lord Pemberton warned. When future sovereigns begin advocating for specific government actions, they transform themselves from unifying figures into partisan actors. This path leads to the irrelevance they claim to be trying to avoid. William read the interview over breakfast at Kensington Palace, his jaw tightening with each paragraph. Kate, reviewing equally harsh coverage in other papers, felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. They had expected some criticism, but the intensity and personal nature of the attacks caught them off guard. Their private secretary arrived with a stack of briefing papers and a concerned expression. "Your Royal Highnesses," he began carefully, "we're receiving requests for responses from dozens of media outlets. The Palace Press Office is asking for guidance on how to handle this situation." Before William could respond, his phone rang. King Charles was calling from Scotland, and his tone was grave. "William, we need to talk immediately. The Prime Minister has requested a meeting about your recent activities, and I've had 3 cabinet ministers express concerns about constitutional boundaries." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of William's life. His father, while understanding the motivations behind the Cwmgrach visit, was deeply worried about the precedent it had set and the potential consequences for the entire royal family. "I admire your desire to make a real difference," the king said. "But you must understand that our influence depends on our perceived impartiality. Once we're seen as taking sides in political matters, we lose the trust that allows us to serve as a unifying force for the nation." William found himself in the position of defending not just his actions, but his entire vision for the monarchy's future. "Father, with respect, the world has changed since you came of age. People don't want unifying figures who stand safely above their daily struggles. They want leaders who understand their problems and work actively to solve them. The debate continued for over an hour, with both men passionate about their positions but unable to find common ground. Kate listened with growing anxiety, realizing that their efforts to modernize the monarchy were creating a rift within the royal family itself. After the call ended, William and Kate retreated to their private apartments to regroup and consider their options. The criticism was harsher than they had anticipated, but what troubled them more was the silence from some quarters they had expected to support their new approach. Their phones buzzed constantly with messages from friends, advisors, and family members, most urging them to issue clarifying statements that would walk back their more controversial positions. The pressure to retreat to safer ground was intense and came from people who genuinely cared about their well-being and the future of the institution. But then other messages began arriving. Sarah Jenkins from CWM Grac texted to say that the Welsh secretary had indeed visited their community and that several families had already received emergency housing, assistance that had been expedited as a result of William's phone call. Gareth Williams sent a photo of the renewable energy training program information session that was being organized in response to their visit. Maria Santos from South London wrote a longer message describing how their conversation had inspired her to start a support group for single mothers in her housing estate, and how the group was already making a difference in families' lives. Jamie from Manchester sent a video message talking about how meeting the royal couple had changed his perspective on civic engagement and motivated him to volunteer with local youth organizations. "Look at this," Kate said, scrolling through dozens of similar messages. "These are real people whose lives have been genuinely affected by what we did. How do we weigh that against constitutional theory?" William stared out the window at the gardens of Kensington Palace, thinking about the stark contrast between his privileged surroundings and the modest homes he had visited in recent weeks. The criticism hurt, but the knowledge that their actions had produced concrete improvements in people's lives felt more important than maintaining traditional protocols. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Dorothy, the elderly woman who had approached Kate outside Westminster Abbey, arrived at the palace gates asking to speak with them. Palace security was initially reluctant to admit an unscheduled visitor, but Kate instructed them to bring Dorothy to a private sitting room. "I hope you don't mind me coming here like this," Dorothy said, slightly overwhelmed by the formal surroundings. "But I've been watching the news and I wanted you to know that ordinary people like me see what you're trying to do, and we appreciate it." Dorothy explained that she had lived through decades of royal visits to her community, polite events where important people made encouraging speeches, and then disappeared back to their comfortable lives. "This feels different," she said. "You're not just visiting us, you're working with us. That matters more than all the fancy protocol in the world." Her visit was followed by others throughout the week. Tom Roberts made the journey from Wales to express his community's gratitude for the practical assistance that had resulted from the royal intervention. A group of nurses organized by Sarah from outside Westminster Abbey came to share their experiences of the healthcare system and to discuss potential solutions. Each visitor reinforced William and Kate's conviction that they were on the right path, even if it was an unconventional and sometimes uncomfortable one. The formal criticism continued, but so did evidence that their approach was making a real difference in people's lives. By the end of the week, they had made a decision about how to respond to their critics. Instead of issuing defensive statements or retreating from their positions, they would continue their work and let the results speak for themselves. They would be more careful about constitutional boundaries, seeking advice from experts about how to maximize their impact while respecting traditional limitations, but they would not abandon their commitment to genuine engagement with the challenges facing modern Britain. The monarchy's survival depended not on maintaining outdated protocols, but on proving its continued relevance to the people it served. 6 months after the controversy over their Welsh visit, William and Kate found themselves facing an unexpected vindication. The renewable energy training program that had emerged from their intervention in Poignant had become a model for similar initiatives across Britain. The Welsh secretary, initially reluctant to meet with the laid-off workers, had become a champion of community-led economic development programs. More importantly, public opinion had gradually shifted in their favor, While constitutional experts continued to debate the propriety of their methods, polling showed that ordinary citizens increasingly appreciated their direct approach to royal service. The phrase working royals had taken on new meaning, referring not just to those who performed official duties, but to those who rolled up their sleeves and engaged with real problems. The transformation had not been without personal cost. The rift with some traditional royal supporters had never fully healed, and William's relationship with his father remained strained over questions of constitutional boundaries. Some longtime palace staff had requested transfers, uncomfortable with the unpredictable nature of the couple's engagements. But new supporters had emerged from unexpected quarters. Progressive politicians who had previously been skeptical of the monarchy began to see William and Kate as potential allies in addressing social inequality. Community organizers who had once dismissed royal visits as meaningless gestures started requesting their involvement in local initiatives. The real test of their evolved approach came when a crisis struck much closer to home. A fire at a London tower block had displaced hundreds of families, creating an emergency that demanded immediate response. Traditional protocol would have called for expressions of sympathy, charitable donations, and carefully planned visits to offer comfort to the affected families. Instead, William and Kate arrived at the evacuation center within hours of the fire. Not as visiting dignitaries, but as volunteers. They helped distribute emergency supplies, comforted traumatized children, and took detailed notes about the immediate needs that weren't being met by official response agencies. Kate spent the night at the evacuation center, sleeping on a cot alongside displaced families and waking up to help serve breakfast and organize childcare for parents who needed to deal with insurance claims and housing authorities. William worked with local officials throughout the night to identify temporary accommodation options and coordinate with charities that were offering assistance. Their presence transformed the nature of the official response. Government ministers who might have delayed their visits for days arrived within 24 hours when they learned that the future king was personally involved. Corporate donations that might have taken weeks to organize materialized overnight when business leaders saw royal family members working alongside firefighters and social workers. But the most significant moment came when William encountered David Chen, a widowed father of 3 whose flat had been destroyed in the blaze. David was struggling with bureaucratic forms while trying to keep his exhausted children calm, and his frustration was evident as he waited in line for the 3rd time to speak with a housing official. "This is impossible," David said to no one in particular. "They want documentation I can't provide because everything burned. They want proof of income from a job I can't get to because I have nowhere to leave my children. How am I supposed to navigate this system when it seems designed to exclude people like me?" William approached quietly, introducing himself simply as Will and asking if he could help with the paperwork. For the next 2 hours, he worked as David's advocate, making phone calls to cut through red tape and connecting the family with resources they hadn't known existed. "You know," David said as they finally secured temporary housing for his family, "I've never been much for the royal family. Always seemed like an expensive luxury to me. But what you're doing here, this feels different. This feels real." The conversation that followed challenged many of William's assumptions about his role and purpose. David shared his perspective as someone who had worked hard, paid taxes, and followed all the rules, only to find himself abandoned by the very systems he had supported when crisis struck. "The thing is," David explained as they watched his children playing with other displaced kids, "most of us don't expect the government or anyone else to solve all our problems. We just want a fair chance to solve them ourselves. But when the system works against you instead of with you, when bureaucracy becomes a barrier instead of a bridge, that's when people lose faith." William found himself thinking about the constitutional criticisms he had faced, about the arguments that royal intervention in political matters was inappropriate. But watching David struggle to rebuild his life while navigating an indifferent bureaucracy, those theoretical concerns seemed less important than the human reality in front of him. Kate joined them as evening approached, having spent the day organizing support groups for the displaced families and working with local schools to ensure that children could continue their education despite the disruption. She had also been documenting the gaps in official services, noting where voluntary organizations were filling roles that should have been covered by government agencies. "We need to talk about systemic changes," she told William as they finally headed home late that night. Individual acts of kindness are important, but they're not enough. We're seeing the same problems over and over again: housing insecurity, inadequate social services, bureaucratic barriers that prevent people from accessing help they're entitled to receive. The fire had crystallized their understanding of their evolving role. They were not just representatives of tradition and continuity, but advocates for ordinary people navigating complex systems that often seem designed to frustrate rather than assist them. Their position gave them unique access to decision-makers and media attention that could be leveraged to create meaningful change. Over the following weeks, they worked with policy experts and community organizers to develop comprehensive recommendations for improving emergency response systems and social services. They established regular meetings with government officials to discuss specific cases and systemic problems they encountered during their community visits. The approach was controversial, but it was also effective. Housing policies were streamlined, emergency assistance programs were expanded, and bureaucratic procedures were simplified in response to specific examples they brought to official attention. More importantly, public trust in the monarchy began to recover and even grow. Polling showed that people increasingly viewed William and Kate as genuine advocates for ordinary families rather than remote figures offering symbolic comfort. The transformation was perhaps best captured in a letter William received from Jamie, the skeptical teenager from Manchester who had challenged them months earlier. "I still don't think we need kings and queens," Jamie wrote. "But if we're going to have them, I'm glad they're people like you who actually care about what happens to the rest of us." As they prepared for bed that night, Kate reflected on how far they had come from that quiet moment of uncertainty in Westminster Abbey. "Do you think this is what your grandmother would have wanted?" she asked William. William considered the question carefully. "I think she would have wanted us to serve our people in whatever way was most needed," he replied. "The methods might be different, but the purpose is the same: to use our position to make life better for the people we serve." 1 year after their pivotal conversation in Westminster Abbey, William and Kate returned to the same quiet corner where their journey of transformation had begun. The ancient stones seemed to hold different memories now, echoing not just with royal history but with the voices of all the people they had met along the way. The year had brought remarkable changes, both in their approach to royal service and in public perception of the monarchy itself. The foundation they had established was now operating community listening centers in 12 cities across Britain, providing direct connections between royal advocacy and local needs. Their monthly People's Forums had become a regular feature of their schedule, bringing together families from diverse backgrounds to share their experiences and propose solutions to common challenges. But perhaps the most significant change was less visible and more personal. William and Kate had developed a deeper understanding of their role that went beyond constitutional theory or public relations strategy. They had learned to see themselves not as figures to be admired from a distance, but as public servants with unique opportunities to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. The morning brought news that perfectly illustrated how their approach had evolved. David Chin, the widowed father they had helped after the Tower Block fire, had been selected to address the United Nations about housing policy innovation. His insights, born from personal experience and refined through conversations with the royal couple, were now influencing international discussions about urban development and social services. "Look at this," Kate said, showing William the news coverage of David's UN presentation. "He's using his platform to advocate for other families facing similar challenges. This is exactly what we hoped would happen. Not that we would solve problems for people, but that we would help them develop the tools and connections to solve problems themselves." Their children had noticed the changes too. George, now old enough to understand more about his future role, had begun asking thoughtful questions about the purpose of the monarchy and how royal service could make a meaningful difference in people's lives. Charlotte had started a charity project at school inspired by her parents' community work, organizing her classmates to support local families in need. Even young Louis, still largely unaware of the complex constitutional questions surrounding his family, had absorbed the lesson that helping others was simply what their family did. His innocent questions about why some children didn't have enough food or warm homes had prompted some of their most important conversations about social responsibility and public service. The personal growth had come with costs that were sometimes difficult to bear. The relationship with King Charles remained complicated, with philosophical differences about royal boundaries creating ongoing tension. Some longtime supporters had never forgiven what they saw as a dangerous departure from established protocols. But new relationships had flourished in unexpected ways. Maria Santos from South London had become a trusted advisor on housing policy, regularly consulting with William and Kate about the real-world impact of proposed government programs. Gareth Williams from Wales had started a successful social enterprise and frequently spoke about how royal support had helped his community rebuild after economic devastation. The elderly gentleman from the food bank, who had initially been skeptical about royal involvement in social issues, had become one of their most eloquent defenders. "They didn't just visit us," he told a newspaper interviewer. "They worked with us, learned from us, and then used their influence to make things better for people like us." That's what leadership should look like. As they sat in the familiar quiet of Westminster Abbey, William and Kate reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The institution they served was undeniably different from the one they had inherited, more engaged and more responsive to contemporary needs, but also more controversial and less predictable. "Do you think we've succeeded in making the monarchy more relevant?" Kate asked, voicing the question that had driven their efforts from the beginning. William considered the question carefully, thinking about all the lives they had touched and all the changes they had witnessed. "I think we've succeeded in making ourselves more useful," he replied. "Whether that translates to long-term relevance for the institution, only time will tell." Their conversation was interrupted by a message from Dorothy, the elderly woman who had first approached them outside the Abbey a year earlier. Her granddaughter had graduated from teacher training college and been hired by a school in an underserved community, fulfilling the dream she had shared during that first chance encounter. "Every time we think we understand the impact of what we're doing," Kate said after reading Dorothy's message, "we discover new connections and new possibilities. It's like throwing a stone into a pond and watching the ripples spread in directions you never expected." As they prepared to leave the Abbey, both felt a sense of completion and new beginning simultaneously. They had found their own way of serving their country and their people, one that honored tradition while embracing necessary change. The path ahead remained uncertain, with challenges that would test their resolve and their judgment, but they faced that uncertain future with confidence born from experience and relationships, built through genuine engagement with the communities they served. They had learned that royal service was not about maintaining distance and dignity, but about building bridges and creating connections that could survive long after individual crises had passed. The afternoon sun streamed through the Abbey's ancient windows as they walked toward the exit, hand in hand as they had been throughout their journey. Outside, London bustled with the energy of millions of people pursuing their own dreams and facing their own challenges. Some of those people had been touched directly by William and Kate's work over the past year. Others had been affected indirectly through policy changes or community programs that emerged from royal advocacy. Many more would never have any direct contact with the royal family, but would benefit from a monarchy that had learned to listen, to learn, and to use its unique position in service of the common good. As they stepped into the London sunshine, William and Kate knew that their conversation in Westminster Abbey had been just the beginning. The real work of building a relevant, responsive monarchy lay ahead of them, in countless communities across Britain and in the daily choice to put service above ceremony, connection above convention. The future of the monarchy they were creating together would be judged not by its adherence to ancient protocols, but by its ability to make a positive difference in the lives of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. And in that mission, they had found not just a new way of being royal, but a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve.